This is the story of the Central Asian nomads. This includes the Turks and the Mongols, who develop a civilization among the steppe lands of Central Asia and develop a semi-pastoral nomadic civilization in which their ability to conquer large areas of land influenced many other civilizations. It's interesting to note that they share, all the Central Asian nomads that we'll talk about, share a similar culture in terms of agriculture, as well as a more egalitarian opportunities for both women and lower classes because of the more interdependence that such a society has. Introducing the Turks of Central Asia. We've actually already met a good chunk of them. They are some genetically related tribes that were not always politically related. We see in this dark yellow area an actual kingdom that united many of the Turkish tribes, but these tribes had actually been in existence long before, so let's just connect to things we've seen before in history. For example, we've already met the Xiongnu, who are related Turkish tribe that come into Han China and influence the end of that classical civilization. There's also some debate among historians, but some connection to the Huns who come into Europe and help end the Roman Empire during that classical period. So both the Huns and the Xiongnu, and even then the White Huns to some degree, are related to these Turkish tribes, and those green arrows then are Turks who helped influence the end of the classical period, what AP identifies as period 2. The blue arrows reference Turkish tribes that influence the post-classical era, also known by AP as period 3. So we've already met the Seljuks. They come into the Abbasid Empire, kind of internally take it over, even causing the Crusades towards the end of that by putting pressure on the Byzantine Empire, shown in this map as the Eastern Roman Empire. We also see a Turkish tribe going down into India during this time. Now, India was predominantly, after the fall of the Guptas, predominantly decentralized and not particularly well organized in terms of politics, but the Ghaznavid come down, a Turkish tribe, and establish a Sultanate of Delhi where they use Islam and the beliefs of Islam to establish a kind of offshoot of the caliphate under one man called the Sultan, who's more local but also an Islamic leader. So this Sultanate of Delhi remains on kind of the border of what is today Pakistan and India, and that India region does not conquer much of Central or South India, but certainly has influence upon the introduction of Islam into that region. If you notice, meanwhile, while all these tribes are going out from the steppe lands, the Uygura kingdom and other Turkish kingdoms are being established in that region. Generally what happens is one man will kind of create a nomadic surge, which he'll take over multiple other tribes and be called the Khan. This establishes a tradition that the Mongols use as well. And no one uses it better than Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, originally known as Temujin, who eventually becomes Khan, that's a title, when he takes over and becomes lord of all of the Turkish tribes and other tribes in the region, is not actually Turkish. The Mongols are a separate tribe coming more from the Manchuria area, east of the steppe lands. However, he comes in and takes over those regions. I think the four words on the board kind of explain best how he ruled. He was incredibly persistent to begin with. He came from a poor family, had been captured as a young child, but eventually worked his way through making alliances and mastering steppe diplomacy in order to take over these other Turkish empires. Another way that he was able to do this was by being ruthless, and in fact that's how, in part, he gained so much respect among the Turks. He kind of had the policy of be spared or die. If you submit to us, we'll spare you. If you in any way do not surrender, then expect to die. This worked really effectively because most people would prefer to be conquered than dead. And so he's able to establish an empire of significant proportions using this policy. One example of this policy in effect is when he sent diplomats to a kind of mid-Persian empire, also a Turkish empire, and they murdered his emissaries, which only resulted in him coming in and murdering every single one of them. This reputation makes him also incredibly effective, because he's effective, and he's effective in using various technology to conquer large regions. He actually conquers the largest contiguous, which means touching, land-based empire. This empire united Turks. He then reorganized the army to make it based on him, not based on local tribal leaders, so it was incredibly loyal to him, and maintained and perpetuated his power. Kind of under effectual as well, he uses new technology. Now, of course, the central nomads, both Turks and Mongols, used horses, and they used small horses that were grass-fed and very fast and hardy, and they also developed new methods of the saddle and other things that makes them incredibly useful in riding these horses, and we'll look at some of those. They adapt siege warfare and bows as well to use and to take over other areas. And finally, Genghis Khan shows a resourcefulness as he tries to establish an empire. He doesn't just conquer, he actually establishes a long-term, consistent empire by using local administration, by taking intelligentsia, the smart people from one region, resettling them to his capital or places where he might need them, similar to what Nebuchadnezzar did earlier and even what the Incas were doing in America. He uses the tribute system, similar to what we saw in China, and also kind of promoted a more tolerance towards religion, which was very different than many of the other empires during that time, and therefore developed a peaceful and unified region that actually encompassed multiple different peoples, groups, and religions. This also encouraged trade, which of course is resourceful because that only brings in wealth to the empire. All right, so the major technology that the Mongols used, as already mentioned, were, one, the horses. They're small, grass-fed, as I said, very hardy. They also use these kind of bows, where you can see the material in this lower picture. They would actually bend it against the curve of the wood, which made them more precise and more powerful when the bow was drawn. They also, in combining these two technologies, developed things like a tighter saddle and other horse gear, which would enable them to turn backwards and shoot as they were riding, making them incredibly deadly. They kind of got creative with their arrows as well, whether that be flaming arrows or whizzing arrows and other things that made them even more terrifying. So they're nomads, so they don't really deal with cities in their everyday warfare among the various tribes, but as soon as they encounter other cities that do in fact have walls and need new equipment, the Mongols adapt really quickly. They bring this contraption called the trebuchet from China, and that's basically a fancy catapult, which they would use to take down walls and even fling enemy heads over the walls to increase their terror. And so they're actually very skilled in their siege warfare. All of this combined to create a ginormous empire that continued long after Genghis Khan, partly because of all the relatives that he had who were able to continue on his rule. So it didn't continue as one unified empire, but his descendants do follow through and continue to rule these regions. We see in the center area, his second son establishes this Khanate. The Khanate of the Golden Horde takes over Russia and continues to be in charge of Russia until the reign of Ivan the Great, or Ivan the Terrible. Over in the east, we see the Khanate of the Great Khan, who was in fact Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And Kublai Khan comes in, takes advantage of the weakness of the Song at the end of that dynasty, and takes over all of China, making actually a new Chinese dynasty known as the Yuan. The Yuan dynasty is marked by a time of peace and trade, even interaction with some of the Europeans, as we see the arrival of people like Marco Polo. but also by an aloofness on the part of the Mongols, as they really viewed the Chinese as very inferior. So not a good time for Chinese history in terms of Chinese people, but certainly a golden age for the region. It's kind of an interesting paradox there. The Ilkhanate, if we turn west of Persia, was more marked by assimilation. While the Mongols had really taken it out on Islam when they had first come through, and Genghis Khan destroying Muslim mosques and regions despite his general tolerance of religion. But as the Ilkhanate develops in Persia, they actually become an increasingly Islamic, which actually contributes to the spread of Islam, as now there is an uninterrupted flow of trade from east to west through this Mongol empire. When you have such a large empire, you can only expect major things to happen, and the spread of multiple, both good and bad, happens through this empire. We see an increase in communication and diplomacy through people like Marco Polo and others, as we see interregional interaction, and certainly increased trade. We also see a spread of religion. This is in part because of Sufi missionaries, Nestorian Christians who were in China and developed through that Asian region, and even new forms of Buddhism like Lama Buddhism, which the Mongol leaders find incredibly attractive. There's also the spread of goods and techniques such as gunpowder. The Chinese had invented gunpowder and started using it militarily, and the Mongols use it even more so, which enables them to continue conquering. As they're conquering, they spread the technology. Finally, and not so positively, we see the bubonic plague spreading thanks to the Mongols, as they, through trade, also spread animals who are carrying this disease. As happens with all empires, the Mongol Empire eventually fell due to internal problems of extravagance on the Persian end and civil war in the Han Dynasty. There were also monetary issues on both sides, and of course the Black Death wiping out a good chunk of the population. This leaves room for a new dynasty and a new empire to arrive, which was Turkish. So we kind of see the Turks at the beginning, an intermediate period where the Mongols are conquering, followed by the return of the Turks, as it were. This is the man, Timur Lane. His name was Timur, and he was lame. Kind of comes down in history then as Timur Lane. He conquers almost as much area as Genghis Khan had done in his lifetime, around the same amount as Alexander the Great, and doesn't go completely into India, but does conquer much of that Middle Eastern area. Timur Lane's conquest, joined to the Ottoman Turks' conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1452 to 53, opens the door to a set of empires which are going to kind of dominate the region for a couple hundred years afterwards, known as the Gunpowder Empires. And that's where we see the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals starting to dominate each of those regions. Thus, showing how both the Turks and the Mongols changed and kind of adapted the region to create a new political structure.